Accountants, let's talk about RPA, robotic process automation. This has been a buzzword in our industry. Every accounting conference you go to, they're talking about it, but who's showing you how to do it? Me. I am showing you how to do it. This is a live session I did for my accountant community. To my knowledge, the very first time that in the wild, anybody did a live hands-on demo of RPA where you can actually build something yourself live along with it. The tool we used here, Electronic, after this went on to get picked up by the AI CPA Startup Accelerator. I'll put a link below for how to get signed up for that tool. Big thing with RPA, a lot of people get sticker shock from the cost. A few years ago, you can get into RPA for less than 50 grand. Now point of entry for RPA like this is well less than 10 grand a year. So this was the 6-week and an 8-week series that I did. Great way to get a basic functional understanding of RPA. If you need continuing education credits, check out the description below for how to get those for this video, and enjoy.
Let's get cracking. I'm quite pumped about this one. So I'll give you full transparency. In my business, I'm the automation guy for everything but RPA. So I've got a young guy that's really good at this stuff. He just gets it and he's able to just figure things out on his own. And so I tasked him with getting his head around Electronic. That's actually why I put the RPA workshop after Thanksgiving, because I wanted the week of Thanksgiving, roll my sleeves up, get comfortable with it. And you know what? It's really easy. Like, it's easier than I expected. I think RPA is kind of intimidating. In the grand scheme of things, compared to the other stuff that we do, it's really not that hard. This is kind of the last step to being able to integrate anything. A quick icebreaker. What do you want to automate with RPA? Clicking around in desktop apps, clicking around in web apps, or automating access to data in legacy apps like tax software, Jeremy Allen, that sort of thing. Clicking around on desktop apps, clicking around on web apps. Okay, very quickly, what is RPA? I'll pull everybody back to me real quick. This is the slide from the very first week. Fundamentally, RPA is building desktop-based bots. So when the SBA talked about and the banks talked about processing all these PPP loans at this unheard of volume, how did they do that? They did it with bots. What that means is they did it with RPA in most cases. So it's the ability to build a bot that looks at your computer, just like you look at your computer, and you program in the logic to make it click around and do stuff for you. In situations where you have legacy systems, oftentimes it's the only way to get data in and out of those systems in an automated way. That's why RPA has been so popular with enterprise, is you get giant things like SAP that are never going to change, that are these big monoliths, and RPA works well with that sort of thing. It's just now coming down market to a price point where it makes sense for little people like you and I. So here's the agenda today. We're gonna start with a very quick basic desktop automation example to show you the basic functions of the program. I'm gonna give you an example of automating something in a browser, because even though this is billed as your way of working in legacy programs, there's a whole lot of things in our browser-based programs that are not automated, that RPA can automate. So we're gonna talk browser automation and then how to pair what we're doing here with an API from the context of working with our tax software. Okay, so Electronic. So it's gonna look the same for everybody. This is what it looks like when you hop in. I've got a few projects I've already worked on here, but I'm just gonna say start development to do a new one from scratch. Electronic is a kind of a visual development platform. So Integromat may be the best parallel from the stuff we've worked on thus far. You build your workflows by dragging things around and then connecting the steps. So you'll see you've got little kind of nodes and they connect to each other. All of these things have a red node, which is basically, what do you want me to do if it doesn't work? You always have to be thinking about what's a graceful way for it to fail and how do I get notified if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. You have logical nodes as well, if statements for branching logic if you wanted to do different things, but that's basically how you design it. I'll quickly talk through these panels. So left-hand side, you've got this activities tab. These are basically all the different types of things it will do. Elements are reusable things like your start button on your desktop or something like that. Your start button is an element that you could add here and keep referring back to in the project. Maybe there's an UltraTac shortcut on your desktop. That could be an element because you're going to open that and do something and then close it. So elements are kind of reusable things that you will keep coming back to in your program. On the right-hand side, properties is just the properties of whatever thing's currently selected. And then variables are things that you can define and keep coming back to. So the client ID, if you're doing something for a client inside your tax software or something like that. That's all the time I'm going to spend on that. And I will dive into the things that I think are most important. These are all different things that it can do for you. So you'll see, specific functionality for, Office 365, working with PDFs, Microsoft Word. It's a lot of stuff for Excel. So there's program specific functionality, and then there is generic functionality, and that's under interface elements. So interface elements is like works over the top of everything, but may not be as deep of an integration as it has for working with a specific row in Excel or doing specific things inside of Chrome. So interface elements is kind of your generic over the top way of doing things. RPA is looking at your screen and using your instructions to determine what to do next. And the hardest part about that is it being able to access that thing it needs to click or know exactly where it needs to click every time in different circumstances. And so the three main ways that you kind of anchor RPA to know where it needs to click or what it needs to highlight or something like that is these three top options here. So the first is clicking on an element. So I'm going to connect this to the start thing. Click on element, and you have to first define your interface element that you want it to click on. So again, elements are these anchors that we define that the bot can come back and interface with over and over again. So I'm going to hit this drop down and say pick a new element. So I've got a red box around the start button. I'm going to hit Control X. It's titled it the start button by default, but you can change the element name to whatever you want it to be. I'm hitting test. It's giving me the yellow box around the start button. I'm not sure why it's saying element not found, but I believe that's working. So let's hit the play button here. This is kind of how you test it, and we'll see if it actually clicks the start button. Okay, it did. So move the cursor down to the bottom left, and it clicked that start button. And now we've got this start element defined that we can keep coming back to. So anytime we want to use the start menu for something, we just click that start button. So that's the first way that you can anchor to something on your screen is by defining an element. Now, that won't always work. It won't always be able to explicitly identify distinct elements on your screen. For example, if you're using a hosted application where it's just showing you like an image of the application, you don't have that granularity of distinct elements. So another alternative for what you can do is you can click on specific coordinates on your desktop. This is not that robust, but if you're running it in a controlled environment, it's, I think, your last resort. So in this case, we can just say set the coordinates. And let's say I wanted to click on my recycle bin. I'm going to hover over that and hit the control key, and it just saved those coordinates. And now when it runs that, it's going to click that spot on the screen that I defined. The one you'll use second most is you can provide Electronique an image and say, look everywhere on the screen and find this image. And when you find this image, click on this spot on the image. This one I find myself using quite a bit. So in order to define what the image is, you can say create the image from a screenshot. So I'm going to click this. This is the screen it's going to take a screenshot of. So I'm just going to hit Control to take a screenshot. And I'm going to crop it down to the image that I want it to look for. So I just want to scroll in. So I'm going to crop it down to this image of my recycle bin and say apply and OK. And then down below here, you'll see this little red dot. this is where on that image you want it to click. So that's the idea behind clicking on images. I'm going to delete these first 2 steps and we can make sure that works as we expect. So it's going to look for the recycle bin image and it ended right away, but it clicked on the recycle bin. So those are the 3 main ways that you anchor to objects on your screen, is by anchoring to a specific element. That's always the best way, always the first way you try to do it. There's clicking on an image, which is fallback if you can't get the specific element. And then there's clicking on a coordinate on the screen, which works in a controlled environment. If you're running this on a virtual machine where nothing's going to move, that works, but that's kind of your last resort. Okay, we're going to make a quick little bot here to do something that I know anybody can do because everybody has Notepad on their computer. And so we're just going to quickly set this up. I'm going to click on an element. I'm going to have it click on the start button, which we've already defined right here. And when you click on the start button, it automatically puts the cursor focus into the search bar. So after clicking on this, I want to open Notepad. And so I'm going to have it type in Notepad. So I'm going to go up here to, I'm going to go to input from keyboard. And I'm going to say, use the focused element. So this is basically just going to type wherever we're currently focused and set the value. I'm going to say Notepad. So let's see if that does what we think it's going to do. Should click the start button and then type Notepad. Okay, so that's straightforward enough. And at that point, all we need to do to open Notepad is hit the Enter key. You could add this as another keyboard input step, or we could just add it to this step right here. How do you get it to push in the Enter key? The easiest way I've figured out to work out the syntax for that is you've got this input from keyboard option right here. You click that, and right now it's listening for a keyboard input. So I'm going to hit the Enter key, and it's put enter in all caps and brackets there. So that's the syntax for pushing an Enter key. So I'm going to say, I'm going to add Notepad before this. And now it's going to type Notepad and then hit the Enter key. And so this then should open Notepad. Okay, so it opened Notepad. In reality, there's a dedicated process for like launching a program. You would probably just use that, but I'm trying to like incorporate the different kind of ways of interfacing with things. What could we do next? We could, let's type a message into there. So I'm going to do interface elements again, input from keyboard. Say, my name is Jim. I'm going to do 2 line returns. So enter, enter. I love RPA. So let's give that a go. And then actually I'm going to add at the end of this a delay of 5 seconds so that we can actually see what it does rather than it closing everything. Okay, so you'll see here, there's an error in the program. So it gives me the red error detail down here. And then a helpful thing it does is it puts a red border around the step that had the issue. And right now it doesn't know where to enter this text that I just provided. So I need to toggle this box to say use the focused element. Otherwise, we could have it enter it on other elements that we defined, but right now we're just going to use the focused element, which is Notepad. So hits the start thing, opens up Notepad, and then types in the stuff that we put in there. So different applications for this. This could be launching a form, entering some sort of data, tabbing through the form fields. But this is kind of an example that I think is going to be easy for anybody to test. So a couple more things I'll show you. Clicking on an element inside of Notepad. So why don't we like change the font or something like that? So interface elements, click on an element. I'm going to pull this step in here. So pick new element. And you'll see as I hover these options, it gives you the red boxes. I'm going to click on format. So hit Control X. In a moment, it gives you this test option. I'm going to say test, and it's highlighting this in yellow. So I think that's working. I don't know why it's saying element not found. And then I'm going to have it click on the submenu item in there. So I'm going to say pick another element. And I want it to pick font. Hit Control X. And that should bring up the font dialog menu. And then we can change the font to, something else. So let's say, pull in one more click on element here, pick a new element, and let's click on Cooper. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna say Control X here. That's actually a bad example because it's dependent upon the scroll state of this dialog box. So if it doesn't open in the same place every single time, it may not see that value that you want to select. So here's a better way of doing the same thing. Rather than using a click on element, I'm going to say set element value. So we still select the element that we want to interface with, but what I'm going to select here is actually this font field right here where you can type it in. I'm going to say Control X. So I'm going to call this font input. Test that. It's highlighting this in yellow, so that's working. And then I'm going to set the value there, and I'm going to set that to Courier. And what that should do now is type Courier into here. And then lastly, let's have it click the OK button. Actually, even better, if you hit the Enter key, it will, if you hit the Enter key, it will basically submit that change. So I'm going to do input from keyboard. It seems a little odd, but in the grand scheme of things, when you talk about the different ways to navigate things in RPA, oftentimes there's not a better option than the keyboard because that's predictable. It's not relying on it looking and finding a specific thing. Simply hitting the Enter key is hitting the Enter key, and that's easy. Okay, I'm going to add a delay here, and so that we can actually see what it does. So it opens Notepad. It's going to type some text in. Should open the font dialog, change that dialog to Courier, and then hit the Enter key to change the text. Okay, the font was already Courier, but I think that worked. Notepad, I think, is kind of like an easy way to try clicking around in an app, because clicking around in any desktop app, by and large, is going to feel the same with your top options and the submenus and stuff like that. But the main thing to keep in mind is you've got those three options of anchoring things: clicking on an element, clicking on an image, and clicking on coordinates. That's all I'm going to show you in this Notepad example. You could go wild there. That Notepad could be a web form. It could be an input page on your tax software. It could be anything. So I'm going to give you one more example. So I've created a base inside of Airtable. And right now it's only got 3 fields. It's got a client ID field, an AGI field, and a federal balance due or refund field. I think the process of hopping into your tax program, selecting the element that you want to pull, honestly, I think that's pretty trivial. Like, I don't think that's very involved. Launching the application, getting to what you want to get to, and then grabbing it. That's fairly straightforward. That's something that you can probably set up to grab a specific number in 5 or 10 minutes. That's not really that hard. So I don't have a way to hop into tax software and grab something as an example. So here's what I'm doing instead. I'm logging into my Realize account, and I'm going to my user profile in the Realize community, and I'm going to pull 2 data points out of fields there. So it gets me through auth. It opens up my profile page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab what's in this display name text box and this headline text box. I'm going to treat that as if that was some sort of data that I grabbed from my tax software. And then I'm going to push it to Airtable. So that's the basic idea here. And this is already logging in and grabbing those 2 data points. And then we're going to push this into Airtable, because I think, to me, like, the compelling application for RPA, when you're talking about interfacing with your tax software, it's building an API for that data. It's not going and grabbing this thing to do this other thing every single time. It's having a database where, just the things that you actually want, the AGI, or do they have a second quarter federal tax estimate, that sort of thing, get that to a place where it's easy to interface with. And so the bot is doing that. It's doing the communication between your tax software and your database. And then you've got a really good database for doing whatever the heck you want on that with Zapier or with Airtable's built-in automations, that sort of thing. So what's the best way to get data into this base? A web form. That's pretty hard to screw up. So what I did was I created a web form with one mandatory field where you define the client ID. And then you can put in either the AGI or the balance due or both if you want it. So if you open up that form, in reality, how you're going to process this data when they submit it is you're going to probably merge it with an existing record. And so you would build that logic into Airtable. And that's pretty straightforward. That's what we were talking about the other day, Katie. But if you're looking at a really bulletproof way to capture data with RPA, then it's pretty tough to beat entering something into a web form. Because you define these fields, it's as simple as entering the data, tabbing through the fields, and hitting submit. So that's what we're going to do with this data that I pulled from my Realize profile. I'm logged into Electronique from another computer. That's why I keep saying you're logged into another computer. Do you want to stay in here? So we've got these two data points, right? It hops into Realize. It grabs my name and this other field. The data there is not really important. The idea is it's grabbing it from a text input field, which you could use the text input field in your tax software. You could use a number from a tax form. But basically, this is how we're defining what data we want to hand off to the web form. So it looks at this input field and it looks at that input field. And those are the two variables that we have that we're now going to hand off to the web form. So what are the next steps? First thing we got to do is we got to launch a web browser, right? And so that's getting into this section here. So browser, these are browser specific functions. So we're going to say open URL. I'm going to pull this down here, and the URL we're going to open is going to be that of the web form. I'm going to copy this, paste that in there. And so you'll notice right now, this is working in tab 2. So all of these steps are in tab 1. And so you can have any number of tabs open doing different things, pulling data between tabs, quite a few applications for that. So it's going to open the URL, and then we want to decide how do we want to navigate the entry of this data. First thing to think about is where is the focus when you load the form? So is the focus already in the client ID field? Because if it is, you can simply just send a keyboard input. So I'm going to load the page. It looks like it doesn't have any focus on any of the fields. If I start typing, it doesn't go anywhere. So the first thing we needed to do is click on an element in the web form. So I'm going to say click on element. And then we're going to select the element we want it to click on. Now, to be able to do this with your browser and select elements, you have to have the Electronique extension. I'm going to hover over what I want it to click, and it's this client ID field. That's where we're getting started, and I'm going to hit Control X. Okay, so something I figured out through trial and error here that's worth understanding because it has applications elsewhere. So I clicked on this thing. It gives you this kind of GUID type name that's not that useful, so I'm going to call it client ID input. But how did it actually identify that thing in the browser? It's worth understanding. So here are all of the things that it identified in the code of the page that makes it say, this is the thing that I want. So right now, this form field has this ID. It has this class name. It has this tag name. It has that, and it has that. And so when the bot runs, it's going to look for a thing on the page that has all of these things. Now, I learned through trial and error the way that Airtable forms work. They dynamically generate this ID every time that you load the page. So this is the ID for that field this time when I loaded the page, but the next time I load this page, it's going to be a different ID and it's not going to find the field. Now, all I have to do to navigate that is uncheck the ID. So if I test this, it's still going to find this field, but it's no longer going to match based on ID. Kind of a fiddly thing, kind of a thing you got to understand, like when it's selecting an element, what is it actually, like what's the logic actually making it pick that element? It's all of these things in here. So you can tinker with these, lock it down more, lock it down less, just something to be aware of. So that's going to click on the client ID element. And so if I have this selected, then all I need to do is type in my client ID is what I would do next. We haven't actually like pulled that from a data point anywhere. So I'm just going to say input from keyboard and type in 1, 2, 3, 4 for my client ID. We have to say use the focused element because it gives you the option to do your keyboard input elsewhere, but we're just going to use the focused element. And then after that, I'm just going to say tab. So it's curly bracket, all caps, tab, and then curly bracket. The only reason I know that is I, at one point, clicked input from keyboard. I hit the tab key and it showed me that it's tab. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4 tab. And so what's going to happen, it's going to come to this page. It's going to say 1, 2, 3, 4 tab. It's going to take me to the AGI field. So the next thing we want to do is another input from keyboard, but this time we're going to use a variable. Okay, jumping in here real quick. This is like the director's cut special features on your DVD. So I bungled this up in the workshop. Let me explain this a little bit better real quick. So what we're going to do is define the next inputs in the form as a variable. What I didn't do in the workshop is I hadn't defined the variables yet up here. So what we've done, we've opened the Realize member page, we've completed the login page, and then we click on the login button basically, and it takes us to that page. But we haven't yet grabbed those data points out of the fields. So the next thing we need to do is get element value. So I'm going to pull this in. I'm going to put this after the login submit. So this is where we click the login button. And then we're going to hop over to the browsers to select the specific element that we want to grab. So I'm going to hover over the display name, hit Control X, and let's call this, let's say display name, doesn't really matter. Hit test to ensure that's working. Okay, it's outlined it in red. Save. Now, when it grabs that element value, it's going to save it to a variable. And let's name that variable something useful. What we're going to do is we're going to put that in the AGI field in the form. Obviously, we're making all this stuff up, but that's a useful name for us. And then we're going to grab one more element out of that Realize page. So I'm going to pull in another get element value. And we're going to define the other field right down here. Okay, so I'm hovering over that, Control X, and call it headline, doesn't really matter, save. And then we're going to call this tax due, because we're pretending this is, a figure that we've pulled from our tax software. Okay, this has got to be one word. So tax due. And then this is going to pick up over where we open the web form. Okay, so overview of what we got so far. Logs into Realize. It pulls the two figures that we want from those fields we just identified. It opens the Airtable web form, clicks on the first field, enters 1, 2, 3, 4 in the client ID, and then tabs to the next field. Before we plug these variables into the next two fields, let's just ensure that this is doing what we're expecting it to do. All right, so it's going to launch Chrome. It's going to pull up Realize, log in, grab those two data points that we want, pull up the Airtable form, and then enter the client ID. All right, so next steps are to enter the two variables into the next field. So right now it entered 1, 2, 3, 4 tab into the first field. So at that stage, it should have pulled us down to the AGI field. So next thing we need to do is another keyboard input. Rather than setting this value, we're going to calculate it from a value because we've got these two variables now. So the value I'm going to use here is AGI, and it'll auto-populate based on the variable name. I'm going to use the focused element because that's where the cursor already is. I'm going to add another input from keyboard to tab to the next field. Use the focused element. One more keyboard input to enter the other variable into that next field. What did we call that? Tax due. Tax due. And then I guess we want to tab one more time and then hit enter to submit the form. So one more keyboard from input, use the focused element, tab, enter. Let's see if it likes that. Grab those data points, pull up the Airtable form. It's going to key in the client ID, and then it should key in those two variables we provided that came from the Realize page. Then I hit submit. So what then happens with that data? I think realistically, it's an automation inside of Airtable that says when a new record is submitted, go find the existing record here and update the amounts. Maybe the bot runs every night and goes into the UltraTax files that had changed the previous day or something like that. And maybe you grab 5 data points out of there and you submit them via a web form. And then that Airtable logic updates that Airtable base so that then any other systems that you have that need access to that, like if you send out quarterly estimate reminders, they can then run on that Airtable API, which is going to be totally reliable and interface with any of the tools that you have. Me personally, a rich database of what is the status of all of my 2020 1040s and all of that stuff in one place so that then I can build other tooling around that. And this RPA is really just serving as that API wrapper around my tool that doesn't have an API. So that's how I would set it up. Airtable makes that really easy with web forms. It's pretty hard for a bot to get a web form wrong as long as it can pull all the data from where it needs to go. It's really easy to submit all that data via a web form. And then you have something that's unheard of as far as tax suites go in terms of an API that you can define and do whatever you want with. That's pretty like fundamentally like profession changing because we've never even really explored what's possible if you have a great API around your tax return software. It's never been a thing. So people don't really think about it. You could design your own tax summary. We've talked about scorecarding in the past. There's all sorts of different scorecarding applications you could do for your tax reporting, all sorts of stuff like that. I think that's all I'm going to do in app here. Can this do loops? It can. All of the normal kind of programming logic type stuff that you can do with code, you can do in here. So you got if then, do while, subprograms. Orchestrator is another tool Electronique has that kind of is an over-the-top tool for managing your bots. So if you have a whole ton of bots in production, it will handle over-the-top reporting back to you if there was an issue, that sort of thing, running them on schedules. In our case, this is new enough for us. Like we're like 6 months into actually heavily using RPA, and we have a small enough number of bots to where it's not a big deal yet. Okay, I'm gonna hop over to this kind of board of ideas here, and you guys feel free to hop in and unmute yourselves or shout at me or whatever. Organize my personal life. Run client payroll. Woo! You could. That feels high stakes, but Godspeed. But you absolutely could. I would be scared to do that right at this stage, if I'm honest. But another thing to think about with RPA, is creating kind of audit trails for what the bot did. So maybe you want to take a screenshot of the steps along the way, or if it breaks, you take a screenshot to see what happened. There are ways to build audit trails around what you're doing so that it's not this mystery thing running in the background that you may not know what's going on. A human in the loop is another way to manage that. So we probably don't talk about this enough with RPA, but if you have a very complex process with a bunch of steps, having human in the loop to make sure all those steps happen, and even if they're providing assistance at certain points, that's still valuable. Schedule C, clients alerting them to potential tax liability. So is that quarterly estimates after you've completed their return, or what's the idea there?
It's Katie, of course. No, I'm trying to think of a way where, so we do QuickBooks or use Gusto for the client, and we're now 2/3 of the way through the year. And it's, hey, dude, if everything's the same as last year, but presumably you're not buying an F-150 on December 30th this year, you're going to owe a chunk of change that you probably weren't counting on. If I could automate that discussion, that would be so awesome.
Yeah.
Not sure this is it's just something to pull, even very clumsily, their net Schedule C income from, say, QuickBooks, whatever, and send an email that says, based on what we're seeing, plan on a tax liability of X. At the very least, that protects you from the, oh my God, how come you didn't tell me phone call?
Absolutely. So correct me if I'm wrong. Right now, I don't think there's not an endpoint for net income for QBO, because it's going to be contingent on reports, stuff like that. If you have standardized reports with your clients, in the same way we just talked about setting up an API for tax data, you could absolutely set up an API for the profitability of your clients within a certain date range. And what the RPA bot's then doing is it's launching QBO, going to the report you want to see, setting the date range, and then grabbing the net income and then loading that into a database. So RPA could absolutely like bridge all of those disparate data points, right? Where it's living in a bunch of different places. And that's interesting. I hadn't even thought about that.
I guess the question, of course, is how much of the load is the RPA actually taking off? So the RPA is you're offloading maybe 10% of the scope of the project onto the RPA. The big bulk of it is, and this also assumes that you have enough small business clients that the automation is worth it. You just talked about having a human in the loop, so you're still going to want to have somebody look at that and make sure that it makes some sense. You're not sending out gobbledygook to the client. So maybe that's not a good example, but again, thinking out loud here.
I think it is, because if you think about that process, I think the reason that process isn't automated at all is that the endpoints, the data points that drive that process aren't automatable without RPA. It depends who's doing the accounting and if you're going to blindly trust those numbers. But if you could get that net income figure automatically, I think then you could at least draft an email that's in a common format that's maybe doing some basic tax calculation, and even send it to one of your internal team members for approval to say, does this look rational? Because what would be valuable to me if I have, clients in QBO is maybe they're doing their own accounting and it's looking like it's going to be a dumpster fire based on the accounting data they have in there. I can send that email and say, hey, do you want us to hop in and do an analysis? Because it's not looking good right now. And that may be the impetus they need to pull you in to do some work on it or do a proper projection.
I think that, yeah. I think that's the main thrust here, is a way to start the discussion, or maybe some combination of pulling a net income and a list of fixed asset purchases and say, okay, here's what we got. And it sounds like we're due for a discussion.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Can it 100% run in the background, or can you create it to trigger manually? You can do it either way. So it's attended and unattended. Attended bots are simply an executable you run from your desktop. So that's kind of the other big thing here is Electronic is the only RPA provider that will let you develop unlimited bots under a single licensing fee and let any number of people use those bots. So when you think about building an API wrapper around UltraTax, stuff like that's cool. That's 20 times as cool in a community, I think. If people are experimenting with different applications for it, like collectively getting to what's the best way to solve for this problem. Two things an admin could do: setting up new clients in a web portal. Absolutely. Create intake forms for new clients to push data into your tax software. Yeah. You always want to be API first. Can you do it with an API? If not, then maybe RPA is the solution. And you're not going to get new client data into your tax software with an API. So I think that absolutely makes sense. If you got a client intake form, it's a great use case for an RPA bot to push that into your tax software. A great RPA use case is like auditing your QBO bank rules over the top. There is no way to do that over the top right now, but this could log into your 120 QBO accounts, pull out all the bank rules and put them in a standardized place, make updates, allow you to review them like in a single place, that sort of thing. So it's eye-opening. There's a lot of things you can do, just a matter of what's the best place to start. So let me wrap this up. How to apply. So you got a few different ways to apply it. You've got your internal processes to think about. Is this a good like glue tool for you? New services. So is there something you can offer your clients that's fully automated that RPA enables? Like maybe you can fully automate that cash reporting. And maybe before you had to do it at X price once a week, maybe now you can do it 5 days a week and it's 3 times the price or something like that, but that's still a good value trade. So like maybe there's new service offering opportunities. And then lastly, client consulting. We've got problems, but we're all pretty forward looking. We use a lot of cloud apps more so than our clients do. Like, good grief, there's a lot of applications on the client side where you could probably throw something together in RPA for them if you want to go down that road.
Pretty wild, right? It's almost a paradigm shift from here are the things that I do to how can I design something that will do those things for me every day. I can almost see a future where we're kind of living and working in parallel with these bots that we develop ourselves, right? Kind of wild and not that hard. This is where it's at today. It's actually gotten even more simple since I recorded this, but it's only going to keep getting quicker and easier. So you're gonna be the accountant that gets put out of business because somebody else figured out something cool like this? Or are you gonna be the one to make it? Be that one. You're not entering bank transactions anymore. You lean into this stuff, and this industry is so exciting. So that's it for this week. I'm releasing more of these week over week. Hit subscribe below. Make sure you don't miss the next one.